its heat pressing down on the weary travelers as if trying to push them into the earth itself. A line of covered wagons creaked slowly across the barren land, each wheel groaning against the dry soil, each horse panting under the weight of the journey. Among the settlers was a little girl named Clara, no older than 7, with hair the color of corn silk and eyes as blue as the sky above. She clutched a small piece of bread wrapped in cloth, the last of her family's meager supplies, and though hunger gnawed at her belly, she held it carefully as if it were a treasure. Her father's face was hard, worn by the struggles of the trail, and her mother's eyes were filled with worry, for every day on this journey felt like a gamble with survival. Yet Clara, in her innocence, carried something they had long forgotten: hope. The land was silent except for the creak of wagon wheels until, from the ridges above, shadows began to move. Horses appeared first, their riders cloaked in buckskin, their faces marked with paint, their presence powerful and commanding. A hush fell over the wagon train as fear rippled through the settlers. Whispers broke out: Indians. Mothers pulled their children close. Fathers reached for rifles. Clara watched with wide eyes as the chief, tall and strong, adorned with a great feathered headdress, approached their wagon. His face was unreadable, his dark eyes scanning every soul. His warriors lined up behind him like an unspoken warning. Her father froze, his hand hovering near his gun. But Clara stepped forward, small and brave, her bread still in her hands. The chief stopped just a few feet away, towering above her, the silence heavy, the settlers holding their breath. Then, in a voice as gentle as a whisper carried on the wind, Clara lifted her hand and said, "You can have my bread." The settlers gasped, some in disbelief, some in fear, for no one dared approach the tribe. Yet here was a little girl offering her last meal. The chief's eyes flickered, a storm of thought behind them, and for a moment the desert itself seemed to hold still. What he would do next, no one could guess, but all knew that this small act of innocence would decide the fate of every soul. Standing in the blazing sun that day, for a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, no one moved. The settlers remained frozen in place, their fear turning into a heavy silence, while the warriors on horseback kept their watchful eyes fixed upon the little girl who dared to break the invisible wall between two worlds. His face carved with lines of age and battle, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of something far deeper. He had seen hunger, he had seen desperation, and he knew what it meant when someone gave away the last thing they possessed. Slowly, he lowered his gaze to the small piece of bread in her hand. The warriors shifted uneasily, some whispering in their native tongue, uncertain whether this was an act of trickery or a sign from the spirits. Clara's father gritted his teeth, his hand still near his weapon, but sweat ran down his brow, for he knew that the smallest wrong move could bring death upon them all. Clara, however, remained unshaken. Her small hand trembled not from fear but from the weight of kindness she carried in her heart. The chief's lips pressed into a firm line as he stepped closer, the sound of his moccasins brushing against the dry earth echoing in the settlers' ears. The little girl tilted her head, her expression innocent yet unwavering, her bread still outstretched like an offering of peace. When the chief finally extended his hand, every settler drew in a sharp breath, expecting violence, but instead his great hand, scarred from years of battle, carefully received the fragile gift from the child's palm. The wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of the desert sage, and in that single gesture the atmosphere began to change. The warriors fell silent, their horses stamping the ground nervously as if sensing the weight of the moment. The settlers looked at one another, some whispering prayers under their breath, unsure if this act meant salvation or doom. Clara's eyes lit up with a quiet smile as if she had always known that kindness could cut through fear. The chief studied the bread in his hand for a long while, his eyes rising again to meet hers. Then he spoke words in his language, deep and commanding, that rolled across the canyon like distant thunder. His warriors straightened, listening intently, though the settlers could not understand. Clara's mother clutched her chest, whispering a plea to God, while her father tightened his jaw, ready for whatever might come. Yet as the chief's words continued, there was no fire of anger, only the measured tone of a leader making a choice. He lifted the bread to the sky as though offering it to the spirits, then lowered it again, his expression softening ever so slightly. The little girl had given her last meal, but in that small sacrifice, something far greater had been set into motion. A fragile thread of trust spun across the divide of fear. The air hung heavy, with silence after Clara's small hand extended the bread toward the towering chief. The settlers held their breath, gripping their rifles tighter, expecting at any moment a war cry to shatter the stillness and bring chaos down upon them. Yet instead, the chief bent slowly from his horse, his great feathered headdress brushing against the dry wind, and his eyes, sharp and unyielding, softened just a fraction as he looked into the child's face. He did not take the bread immediately. Clara's hand trembled slightly under the weight of so many eyes, but she did not pull back. She remembered her mother whispering that kindness had power greater than weapons, and though her stomach growled with hunger, she found the courage to give away the one piece of food she had left. The chief finally reached down, his massive hand, weathered by battles and time, brushing against her tiny fingers as he accepted the bread. A murmur rippled through the warriors behind him, some whispering in their own tongue, others staring in disbelief that a settler child would dare such a gesture. Clara's father stiffened, fearing this act might provoke anger, but instead the chief broke the bread in half, lifted a piece to his mouth, and chewed slowly. His face remained unreadable, yet the silence that followed carried a strange energy, as though the land itself was waiting for his judgment. The other half of the bread he lowered back to Clara, pressing it gently into her hand, a silent acknowledgement that her offering had been received with honor. A wave of confusion swept over the settlers. Was this a sign of peace or merely the calm before the storm? Then one of the warriors, scarred and stern, rode forward, pointing toward the wagons, speaking words the settlers could not understand. Fear surged again, mothers clutching their children tighter. But Clara stood still, holding the half of the bread the chief had returned, her eyes fixed on him with a strange trust. He raised his hand, signaling his warriors to wait, and for the first time his voice carried across the desert in a deep, commanding tone. Though the settlers could not grasp his language, they sensed the weight of his words. This moment was not one of war, but of choice. Clara's simple gift had stirred something no weapon could achieve, and though the outcome remained uncertain, the spark of change had been lit. The air seemed to hang heavy with silence as the warriors remained mounted, their eyes fixed on the small child who had dared to cross the invisible barrier between fear and trust. The settlers, still frozen by uncertainty, whispered nervously among themselves, their hands never straying too far from their rifles. Yet none had the courage to break the spell of the moment. Clara's father stood rigid, his jaw clenched, torn between pulling his daughter back into safety and letting her face the unknown with a courage he himself had long forgotten. The chief's hand hovered just above the offering, the bread wrapped in the tiny girl's fingers, and his eyes sharp as a hawk's softened for the briefest instant, as though some hidden memory stirred within him. Then, slowly, with deliberate care, he reached forward and took the bread from her hand. The crowd gasped, some expecting him to toss it to the dust or crush it beneath his fingers, but instead he held it with respect. One of the warriors shifted uneasily on his horse, his face tense with suspicion, yet the chief raised his hand slightly, a silent signal for patience. Clara did not flinch, nor did she step back. Her small frame stood as steady as a tree rooted in a storm, her eyes unblinking as she watched him. Then, in a move that startled everyone, the chief broke the bread in two, the dry crust cracking loudly in the desert stillness, and he raised one half to his lips. Slowly, deliberately, he ate it, his face betraying no emotion. And then, to the astonishment of all, he lowered the other half into Clara's small hands, returning the gift. A murmur rippled through the tribe, low but audible, like distant thunder, while the settlers looked on with wide-eyed disbelief. Clara glanced at the bread now resting in her palm, her lips parting in surprise, and though hunger still gnawed at her stomach, she did not eat it. Instead, she smiled, a faint but pure smile that carried more weight than words could ever hold. The chief turned slightly to look at his warriors, and without a sound, they lowered their spears, their posture easing ever so slightly, though their eyes never left the settlers. For a moment, time itself seemed to bend, the desert sun blazing down on a scene no one could have imagined. A Yet deep in every heart lingered the same question. Was this fragile gesture the beginning of peace, or merely the calm before a storm that would decide all of their fates?